tell about his professorial lecture, Growing Points in the Biology of Insects, that we say social insects and that. So first of all, I would like to welcome campus principal and pro-vice chancellor, Professor Clement Sankat, for this professorial inaugural lecture. And also I would like to welcome Professor Inder Ram Narayan, the Dean, University of the West Indies, for this inaugural lecture. And I would like to welcome each and every one, my brothers and sisters here. Everybody I would like to welcome again. And also, I would like to welcome Professor Clement Sankat, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal, to make opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Shivananda Nayak, Acting Chair of the Open Lectures Committee of the St. Augustine campus of the UWI, Professor Inder Ram Narayan, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology, Professor Christopher Starr, our distinguished lecturer this evening, or our star boy this evening, Dr. Sharon Hutchinson, lecturer, Agricultural Economics and Extension, my colleagues of the St. Augustine campus, and I'm pleased to see some of our retired colleagues here also, students of the campus, both undergraduate students and postgraduate students, ladies and gentlemen, invited guests, a special good evening to all of you, and it is truly a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's inaugural professorial lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Christopher Starr, Professor of Entomology of the Department of Life Sciences. This is our very first professorial lecture for this calendar year, and I expect there will be quite a few more in the months ahead. These professorial lectures are indeed very special for many reasons. First, as you will appreciate, the title of professor is not one that is earned very easily. Rather, it is an accolade that requires tremendous hard work, dedication, commitment, and yes, sometimes passion for a particular area of research. It is for this reason that the attainment of the professorship is very special to the individual, as it underscores their perseverance, discipline, and resolve in the pursuit of academic scholarship, academic excellence, and distinction. But these professorial lectures are also very special to our university, as they provide a medium for sharing some of our university's research output and a platform for highlighting some of the creativity and intellectual talent that resides within our campus and our regional university as a whole. In fact, these lectures give credence to a boast that we at the UWI have made many times before in stating that we have some of the world's greatest researchers here at our institution. Professor Starr's extensive research in nesting biology and the behavior of social insects has allowed him to achieve an excellent academic track record. I say this because he has published over 90 publications across the fields of biology, history, the history of science, and ethnobiology. Let me say that I was part of the committee of the University Assessments and Promotions Committee that treated with Professor Starr and considered his application for promotion to professorship. And I am very sure in my own mind that Professor Starr represents one of a very special class of biologists in the world who are working and who have distinguished themselves in this area. So I want to really congratulate you, Prof. You have put the University of the West Indies on the world's map. He has not only distinguished himself as a vibrant researcher here at the UWI St. Augustine campus, and by extension our regional UWI, and he has been doing this here for about 20 years, but he has also done so internationally. He has served as a visiting specialist in Taiwan, a postdoctoral associate in horticulture at the University of Georgia, a postdoctoral fellow in entomology at the Smithsonian Institute, and as a professor at the De La Salle University and the Visayas State College of Agriculture, both in the Philippines. Professor Starr's presentation this evening will address the topic, growing points in the biology of social insects, and therefore probe several thought-provoking research questions. And Professor Starr, we do look forward to this lecture. In closing, let me thank all of you for coming out this evening in support of this inaugural professorial lecture by Professor Starr. At the UWI, we are committed to rewarding excellence, and it is with great pride and honor we pay tribute to his contribution to the field of entomology. Professor Starr, on behalf of the St. Augustine campus, and I would say on behalf of the University of West Indies, I say congratulations to you on your achievement of this professorship. Let me also congratulate the Department of Life Sciences for the stellar work it is doing in the area of research. I wish you the best, Prof, in all your future endeavors, and that you will continue to put the University of West Indies on the map through your efforts. I thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your opening remarks. As principal rightly said that Professor Starr is the star of this evening, but we know about him, but many of us in the audience would like to know what Starr is doing here and what about him. So I would like to welcome Professor Inder Ramnarayan, Dean, Science and Faculty of Science and Technology, to introduce the speaker of today's evening.
Thank you very much, Professor Nayak, chair of the acting chair of this committee. Professor Clement Sankat, campus principal and pro-vice chancellor. Professor Chris Starr, our featured speaker today, given his inaugural professorial lecture. Dr. Sharon Hutchinson. Professor John Agard, head of the Department of Life Sciences. Students, staff of UE, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, good evening, everyone. So I have the distinct pleasure today, this evening, of introducing Professor Chris Starr. Chris was born in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, several years ago, probably many years ago. I won't reveal the year. And his early schooling was in Canada, United States, and Germany. He did his BA in biology at Carleton University in 1973, and an MA in entomology at the University of Kansas, and graduated in 1976. His PhD was in entomology at the University of Georgia, and that was in 1981. And as Professor Sankat mentioned, he had quite extensive postdoctoral experience. And this included stints at the National Museum of Natural Science in Taiwan, a stint at the Smithsonian Institution, also at the De La Salle University in the Philippines, and Visayas State College in the Philippines. Chris is a member of several societies, such as the American Arachnological Society, the American Name Society, the Association of Caribbean Historians, the Caribbean Academy of Sciences, as well as the Entomological Society of Washington. He has also served in a professional capacity as the editor of the Palestine Information Bulletin, editor of the Chinese Journal of Entomology, and as an archivist at the International Union for the Study of Social Insects. But what about Chris Starr, the man? We can say a lot about Chris. When you meet Chris, you might, you might figure that he's, you might think he's a little bit strange. And I can say that most likely you are right. He believes in only three things. That is love, bugs, and revolution. He cannot tolerate the cold. And if you've been to his office, he always has his window open because he cannot tolerate air conditioning. But many of you would not know that he is multilingual. He speaks Spanish, French, German, Portuguese, and as well as some difficult languages such as Russian and Mandarin. He also hosts a weekly radio show called Ecotones, and this is on environmental topics, and this is on FM radio 101.7. Chris joined the Department of Zoology in 1991 as a senior lecturer in entomology, and actually served as head of department for a year. During difficult times for the department, he was promoted to professor of entomology in 2012, and he's a very accomplished field naturalist and entomologist. He has over 90 scholarly papers and has supervised several graduate students. So today, we are very fortunate to have him speaking to us on the growing points in the biology of social insects. So we now welcome to the podium Professor Chris Starr.
Thank you very much, Dean Ramnarine, for that smooth introduction. Friends and neighbors, when Patricia Mohammed gave her lecture in this series not so very long ago, the front row was occupied by members of her family and some other seats as well. Her parents were there, her husband, some siblings, I believe, and for all I know, a gaggle of cousins. She opened with a substantial series of acknowledgments of these and other worthies. And as she did so, I asked myself, is this really necessary? And immediately answered my own question, yes. A professorial inaugural lecture is, among other things, a public recognition that an individual has arrived in academic terms. And the collective nature of this accomplishment should be acknowledged. Now, I'm an orphan and a bachelor, and none of my relatives even lives in the same continent, so I don't have a posse with me tonight. But I'm not about to pretend that I got here on my own. So what I'm going to do is to introduce you, by way of photos, to representatives of the many who have helped me out along the way. Now let's see, should we take the lights down a bit? Are you seeing this okay? All right. I got my start in entomology on the ancestral farm north of Toronto one day in the summer of 1954. Yes, I did say 1954, when my grandmother, Elma McGrew Starr, asked me, and I quote, "Christopher, would thee like to go bug collecting?" And I said yes. Smartest thing I have ever said. My entire life in science can be regarded as a series of footnotes to that one long ago yes. Now, my grandmother's idea of bug collecting was not complicated. We would catch whatever we could with impunity in the vegetable garden and elsewhere, and preserve them, preserve our specimens in a jar of methyl alcohol, which we kept on a shelf in the bathroom. And I remember distinctly going in and looking up at our collection with my eyes hanging out. These things were from the moon. And although it took me a while to realize it, from that day forth, my course was set. I was destined to live out my life trying to penetrate their buggy little lives. I wasn't always an orphan. My parents, Francis and Dorothy Starr, were cool. They considered it perfectly in order that their firstborn should spend his leisure periods collecting and studying bugs. And at Christmas and for my birthday, I seldom got things like fire engines. No, I got bug books. Here's one of them right here. S.W. Frost's Insect Life and Insect Natural History. I believe this showed up in my Christmas stocking when I was 12. Just to give you an illustration of how into it I was. One day I was perusing the books that a university student friend of the family was studying for his courses. And one of them especially caught my attention. It was by one William Shakespeare. And the title leaped out at me. Antony and Coleoptera. I kid you not. I've always considered myself very fortunate in my schooling. In high school, Warren Stetzel explicated the mysteries of language, English and Spanish, in ways that continue to bear fruit today. In undergraduate school, my lecturer in entomology was Elizabeth Arneson, seen here as a student, and it was such a joy to have a lecturer who shared my view of insects and arachnids as the most interesting feature of the known universe. In graduate school, I studied ethology, that is animal behavior, with Rudolf Janda. Now, Professor Janda's main research area was visual pattern recognition in animals. And he showed how one could pose questions about how the world looked to a honeybee, and by means of training experiments, the answers to those questions could be known. It was scientific. It wasn't just romantic guesswork. I wasn't always a bachelor, and without making a big deal of it, let me just say that all in all, I regard my associations with Anne Maureen Regan, Maria Teresa Miguel, and Karen Mara Granado as a good thing. Now, some scientists prefer to work in research institutes, but many of us are very happy working in academia. What's the difference between the two situations? Well, students. Now, some of you may think that having a job that requires daily interactions with students must be a real pain in the tuchus, pardon my Yiddish. But in fact, let me point out that that kind of contact is an important component in keeping us sharp, because students don't share our presumptions, and so they're always reminding us of the kinds of things that we don't know. I believe it was Jason Alamu who in class one day asked me why there are no resident breeding why no corbeau, vulture, has a breeding population in Tobago. Okay, pretty good question. So I went and I did some checking and I did some figuring and was able to come back to class the next day with an apparently satisfactory answer to a question that I must admit had not occurred to me. Now, you've all certainly noticed that scientific research nowadays is a collaborative enterprise. You look through any journal and you will not see very many single author papers. Where do our collaborators come from? Various places, but some of our best collaborations happen with students. So that it's a mutually beneficial situation. And in this way, I've been able to assist Shane Bala, Mario Besesser Singh, Joanne Sulau, and Craig Western, among others, in finding out a few things that nobody had ever known before. Let me also point out that Joanne was the one who helped me put together these slides, which is why I'm not doing this talk on an overhead projector. Okay, I've cleared my throat, and I'm mindful that you've given up a perfectly serviceable Thursday evening to come and hear me. If it wasn't for this right now, Jonas Sahai would be off playing tennis. So I think we better get down to work. I'm going to address three questions. What are social insects? What are growing points? And the main event, what does the one have to do with the other? Social insects are a peculiar minority, accounting for about 2% of all species of insects, that live in durable structured groups known as colonies. They, with very few exceptions, belong to four great groups. Most wasps are solitary, but some are social, such as these maribones that we see here. Likewise, some bees, such as these stingless bees and honeybees, are social. All ants are social, as are all termites. Now, the first of these three groups belong in the order Hymenoptera. The last, the termites, comprise the order Isoptera. So that will tip you off right away that the termites are only very distantly related to the others. And these islands are well provided with members of all of these four groups, which is one of the main reasons that I was so pleased to immigrate, or as the Americans say, defect, to Trinidad and Tobago. Within the Western tradition, social insects have attracted scientific attention from the time of Aristotle, more than 2,000 years ago. Although as a coherent subject matter, social insect biology dates from only the 1920s. It is today a thriving discipline organized by the International Union for the Study of Social Insects, with its own journals and congresses, and with an impact in ecology, ethology, and evolutionary biology far out of proportion to its number of species. The key to understanding social insects is the concept of caste, the roles that different kinds of individuals play within the colony. The primary caste division is between those in the colony that do most or all of the reproducing, and those that do little or none of the reproducing and instead attend to all of the other colony maintaining tasks. And as a good general rule, they start out very much alike physically, but then differences between them appear over evolutionary time. So that the queens, for instance, come to be larger than the workers. The reproducers are the queens in wasps, bees, and ants, the queens and kings in termites, while the non-reproducers are known as workers. In the wasps, bees, and ants, the workers are all female, so that the males live for just a short time, they mate, and then they die. They don't really have any participation in the colony. Unlike animals, in plants, most growth is concentrated in particular places, known as meristems or growing points, especially the shoot tips and the root tips. This serves as a good analogy for the growth of any scholarly discipline, in which at any given time, only a fairly small number of the major problems that are on the table are really promising, are going to bear most of the fruit. Now, you might imagine that scientists ask themselves from time to time, what are the growing points in my field? And I suspect that most do. You might also imagine that leading practitioners in any given discipline will directly address this question from time to time. And sometimes this does happen. Most famously, probably, at the International Congress of Mathematics in 1900, David Hilbert set forth 23 unsolved problems that he considered to be the most important problems in mathematics at that time. This had a tremendously stimulating effect, so that over the next decade, so I'm told, each of Hilbert's problems was either solved or shown to have no solution. Similarly, at the International Congress of Genetics in 1932, Thomas Hunt Morgan set forth exactly what were the growing points, what was most importantly on the agenda in his discipline. Now, I could cite other examples, but not very many. And that's a curious thing. There seems to be a curious reluctance among scientists to say in publication, this, and this are the most important questions, the growing points in our discipline. And I think here we may see a reason for it. In doing just that, Edward O. Wilson seemed to feel obliged to justify what he was doing. And even though Ed Wilson, at that time was already an important public intellectual and given to bold thoughts and pronouncements, yet as you can see in this quotation, he seemed to feel like he was asking for trouble to say specifically what were the growing points. Well, this seems like as good an event as any to ask for trouble. So without pretending to Hilbert's, Morgan's, or Wilson's stature, I'm going to set forth a vision for where social insect biology is going in the coming period by way of a discussion, a description of the 5 growing points that I recognize. The various lineages of social insects are all evolved from solitary ancestors. So let's look at a representative point of departure. Now, you have probably seen mud dauber nests around buildings. We see them around campus. This is, we can treat as a typical solitary wasp. And the female gathers spiders, which she stings into paralysis. She builds a cell, stocks it with spiders, lays an egg on it, seals it, and then forgets about it, and builds another cell, and goes through this cycle. So that in the outer cycle here, we have the immatures, and here we have the mature offspring. Incidentally, I'm going to be showing you some more diagrams like this. If the diagrams don't really work for you, don't worry about it. It's just, they're useful for those who think visually, but we'll work around it if they're more confusing than anything else. So every one of those adult offspring then emerges from the cell and flies off and nests on her or his own. Has no further contact with the mother. Now here is a beloved insect to all of us, I'm sure. This is a typical Jack Spaniard. And this will serve as a good contrast to what we've just seen. The Jack Spaniard female founds a nest and starts laying eggs and rearing up brood. In time, these emerge. And here is the critical difference, right here. Those first females, always females, instead of flying off and nesting on their own, remain at the nest to help their mother. In other words, they relinquish their own reproduction to serve as workers to boost their mother's reproduction. And that presents something of a dilemma, because you would think that natural selection would work against this form of reproductive altruism. Now, the origin of sociality in insects has been recognized as a key problem for almost 100 years. And in a recent, much praised book, it is identified as one of a small number of major evolutionary transitions in life on Earth since the beginning. So it's been with us for a long time, but that doesn't mean that the proposed answers have remained the same during all of this time, or even that the question has had the same meaning throughout all this time. Now let me illustrate this. Social insects, or strictly speaking, eusocial insects, are defined according to 3 criteria that are not found in solitary insects. There is in the colony more than one generation of adults, parents and offspring. The adults do not exclusively care for their own offspring, their own brood. And there is a differentiation to one degree or another between those that reproduce more and those that reproduce less, reproductive castes. Now, for a time, there was a great deal of question in the sequence in which these 3 criteria appear in the evolution of sociality. And as a young man, I analyzed this, and you'll notice that if it's in a stepwise fashion, there are 6 possible sequences from one to the other to the other. Could start with one of these and then go to another and then to another, 6 possibilities. And so I looked at those and concluded that 3 of them were all but impossible. Another one was not much more likely. And then of the 2 remaining ones, one, shown here as A, B, C, was by far the most probable and was possibly universal in the various independent evolutions of sociality. Well, fortunately, that wasn't the only thing I wrote in that paper, because this question is now considered moot. Nowadays, we consider that eusociality, rather than being something that is acquired stepwise in evolution, is a single adaptive syndrome, a package deal that can be evolved very quickly. For a time, it was considered that the key to reproductive altruism was to be found in very high degrees of relatedness, so that genetic interests had a high overlap. And nowadays, the consensus appears to be that high degrees of relatedness are a necessary underpinning, a necessary condition for sociality, but that they are not a sufficient condition, that it requires more than that to explain it. That, in fact, our attention has turned to particular conditions favoring sociality. And once again, this is Polistes, Jack Spaniard again. These wasps are a favored type of model organism in studies of the evolution of sociality. For one thing, they are at a very primitive state of eusociality. One where, for instance, the queens and the workers are physically indistinguishable. In addition, they're large enough to see clearly, they're often locally abundant, and on this kind of an open comb nest, they're relatively easy to observe. There are about 200 species of this worldwide genus. So why have they crossed the threshold from solitary life to eusociality? Well, I'd like to turn that question on its head and ask instead, why are there no solitary Polistes? Of all of these 200-some species, in all of these conditions, all of these very variable environmental conditions, in very diverse habitats, in all continents except Antarctica, how is it possible that none of them has reverted to a solitary way of life? Well, first of all, are there really no solitary Polistes? The social behavior of only a small number of them has been directly studied, so how can we be sure? Well, I made up a solitary Polistes and said, what are the features of it? How would we recognize it? Well, it would have quite a small nest, probably very, very seldom as many as 20 cells. It'd have very small colonies, almost never more than one fully mature female on the nest at one time. And because there would be no workers, remember the workers are all female, because there would be no workers in the population, the number of males and females would be much the same. So we can tell, we can look in museum collections and see if there are species in which, just based on what people collect, the sex ratio is balanced 1 to 1. And through this and looking through the literature, I was able to effectively say that about 1/3 of the known species have features that are incompatible with solitary life. So as far as we know, there are no solitary species, and there's a reason to believe that at least a very substantial minority are proven to be social. Well, if there are solitary Polistes, where might we look for them? Years ago, a pair of very clever Japanese graduate students reasoned that if any species lived in a habitat where the growing season was very short, so that there was no time to produce workers, only reproductives, then what you would have is a solitary nesting cycle. You would have solitary Polistes. And these clever students said, well, where might we look for that? Now, they were graduate students at the University of Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, and they knew that there was one species that came as far north as their hometown of Sapporo. They also knew that that species did not reach the northern end of Hokkaido. So they did the sensible thing. They started observing until they got up to the northern edge of the range, reasoning that there would come a time, there would come a place where the growing season was so short that the population would be forced to be solitary. Very sensible idea, but that's not what they found. They found that the nests got smaller, the colonies got smaller, but the wasps remained social right up to the very limit. Well, okay, that's how it is in Hokkaido. What about other places? So I thought, well, I went and I thought, I'm going to try that similar transect in Siberia and in Argentina. See if I can replicate their results or find solitary Polistes. Well, it was a good thing that wasn't the main reason why I was in Siberia and Argentina, because I mean my efforts were a complete bust. Simply because I never found anywhere near the polar limits of their range. I couldn't find enough colonies to get decent results. However, I did much better in North America. Now, in Canada, by looking in museum specimens and by communication with entomologists, I was able to specify a large number of localities where there certainly were Polistes, as well as some, as well as some where Polistes was certainly absent. So these hollow squares indicate places where it is not. And so that gives us an estimate of where the northern edge of the range is for this genus. And these ones here I collected myself in the field. I did that by going up and down the Gatineau Valley of Quebec, looking for Polistes, counting their abundance, and what I found was that there came a point around about Casabazua where within the space of just about 10 kilometers, the Polistes went from being really quite abundant to being absent entirely. And as Soichi Yamane and Tadeo Kawamichi had found in Hokkaido, all the way up toward the northern limits, the colonies were getting smaller, the nests were getting smaller, but even right up at the limit, they remained social. So let's take it as given that there are no solitary Polistes. Why is that? Might it be that there is some particular reason why it's impossible to revert to solitary life? Now, if the question were asked about honeybees, very easy. Yes, there are certain things about honeybees. They have lost certain capabilities so that they cannot possibly revert to solitary life. But that's not true in Polistes, and the proof of it is very simple. A Polistes queen in the early stage of the colony cycle, when she is all alone with no workers, is effectively a solitary wasp. She has to do all of the things that a solitary wasp does. Well, might it be that there is some so great payoff in remaining in the colony and serving and helping mother that makes it so that in every condition throughout the world, social life is superior to solitary life? Well, that's possible. Here is members of the bug group of the Naturalist Club went and collected a whole lot of old nests of Polistes. Now, the nests can persist for a very long time. So we went through a couple of localities, and in one we collected something over 700 nests, and then we looked at the age of the nest in terms of the size of the nest, the cells. And here you see a life table. So in the beginning, pardon me, there are more than 700. At the next stage in size, there are somewhat fewer and fewer and fewer, until you get down to where there are almost none above 300 cells or more. And doesn't it look like there is an inflection point right there, such that there is very high mortality early on, and after that the chances get much better? Well, as it happened, this inflection point comes just at about the size when the first workers emerge. So this is consistent with the hypothesis that indeed there is a big payoff to being social, that it is much superior in terms of reproduction. And with another, a related wasp, similar to this one, Somdet Bagan did a similar series with some hundreds of nests and found a very similar pattern. So this is consistent with the hypothesis that in all conditions throughout the world, there is that sociality is superior. But it's just consistent with the hypothesis. It's still just one way of working away at this general question of the origin of sociality, and it may apply to other groups of social insects, it might not. In many important respects, the social insect colony resembles a multicellular organism. Both organisms and colonies tend to evolve toward greater integration, greater internal control, and more precise division of labor among the parts. However, there is a fundamental difference between them. The cells in your body are all genetically alike, identical. In a social insect colony, they're almost all family members, so that there is a high degree of genetic overlap, but it's not complete. The social insect colony is not a clone. So that means that there is a zone of genetic conflict of interest. And that means it's possible that this genetic conflict of interest will be manifested behaviorally. In a landmark paper, Robert Trivers and Hope Hare showed that although workers cannot normally produce their own offspring, nonetheless, they, because of the pattern of relatedness within the colony, they have different optimum preferences regarding the sex ratio of the offspring that the colony produces. And so this gives some scope for behavioral conflicts arising out of the genetic conflicts. Now, Trivers and Hare, based on their study of ants, concluded that the workers win this conflict. Some later papers have concluded also that workers win in these or other groups. Some have concluded just the opposite, that in some species, in fact, the queen is winning. But there are some rather peculiar results that indicate that neither is winning, but rather that the colony is winning, in the sense that the outcome of the struggle is one that diminishes the struggle, that dampens the struggle. Well, this suggests that there may in fact be natural selection at the level of the whole colony. Now, this is not a new idea. It was first set forth by Charles Darwin in 1959. I myself have never taken it seriously until recently. Some of these new results suggest that that may in fact be the case. Now, as we've seen, the social insect colony cycle closely resembles the life cycle of a single organism. The colony comes into being, it grows, it reproduces, and finally it senesces and dies, just as we do. The attempt to understand life cycles of individual organisms is known as life history theory, and that is today a mature discipline. While the understanding of what shapes colony cycles is at quite an early stage. What we can do is to classify colony cycles into 4 types according to 2 parameters. In some, there's Polistes up there again. In some, the reproductives found a new colony by themselves. This is known as independent founding. While in others, they have the aid of workers in such things as honeybees, stingless bees, and maribones. So that's one parameter. The other one has to do with whether there is just one reproductive episode and then the colony dies, which is known as a determinate colony cycle, or whether the colony can send out reproductives, propagules, repeatedly. And that is known as an indeterminate colony cycle. And we've got enough basic data to put most of the social insects into one or another of these 4 basic colony cycles. And a general theory of the colony cycle would have to explain why one of the 3 possible cycles is very uncommon. The main advance to date toward a general theory of the colony cycle is found in an important book on ants by Andrew Burke and Nigel Franks. It does a lot. However, I think it misleads in one important way. Now, what Burke and Franks have done is to take the mature discipline of life history theory and to draw analogies with the emerging discipline of colony history theory and say, well, we predict that this will be the case. That's good. It's a very sensible thing to do. Unfortunately, they very often take those predictions as having been demonstrated, when in fact they are simply a very good source of hypotheses. One key difficulty lies in compiling comparative data, because very often biologists will do their studies on one species or another, and will, in the course of it, gather important data that could contribute toward a general theory of the colony cycle, but it doesn't have to do with their particular project. They don't publish them. There's a lot of stuff sitting in notebooks, and that's unfortunate. I have long thought that what is needed is a repository for these data, and there is a ready model, and that is the Human Relations Area Files, which have existed as a database in anthropology and have served anthropology well for some decades. And I was pleased to learn just recently that the North American section of the IUSSI has set up a database along just these lines. So we hope that'll bear fruit. Social insects undoubtedly have enormous effects on the environment. So some ants, such as these bachaks, turn over and mix the soil, which is very good for the soil, makes it more productive. They're very important agents in turning over the soil. Termites are the main agents in the physical breakdown of dead plant matter. So that if there were no termites up there in the northern range forest, it would take much longer for fallen trees to be broken down and their nutrients to be taken up by new vegetation. And of course, I expect you're all aware that social bees are among the most important pollinators, critically important to the health of forests, for instance, and also in agriculture. So much of the food that you ate today depends on pollination by social bees, especially honeybees. However, our understanding of the relationship between sociality itself and ecology is still in quite an unformed condition. We don't even really know how numerous social insects are, although we pretend that we do. Now, here is a cautionary tale for students. Sometimes you may see, it's often repeated, statements such as this, that around 30% of the entire animal biomass in the New World tropical rainforest is made up of ants and termites. It's repeated over and over again. And if you follow the thread in the literature, you will find that it all goes back to one paper published 40 years ago. Furthermore, that paper wasn't about insects. It was a survey of plant life in the Amazon, and just while they were at it, they made some rough surveys of insects, and they sort of guesstimated. I mean, it really was not much better than a guesstimate. Well, it would be ideally, that kind of a guesstimate would serve as a stimulus for people to go out and find out what the real number is. We know that ants and termites especially are hugely abundant in the forest, but how much of the biomass do they make up? But instead, this guesstimate has been taken as demonstrated and has had the opposite effect. It's had a stultifying effect on research. And so I've scolded some of my colleagues. I've had to tell them, stop saying this. We don't know that it's true. It's having bad effects. Hopefully, some studies will go into measuring the real abundance and biomass of social insects. It's certainly going to be very large. Is it anywhere near 30%? let's be frank and say we don't know. And that will serve as an important beginning to measuring the ecological importance of various social insects and of social insects as a whole in the environment and in different environments. It'll be a large task, probably a fairly straightforward one. Now, some colleagues believe that social insects, in a real sense, rule our terrestrial environment. And a case can be made that that is true. There is a wonderful documentary about ants called The Little Creatures That Rule the World. Wonderful movie. Now, does that mean that sociality rules the world? At this point, let me just say that in the coming period, we can expect attention to this radical question to deliver some very interesting insights. Now, at first, I had planned to leave aside the question of the relationship between the genome and sociality for the very simple reason that genomics is, for me, an area of almost pristine ignorance. But then I said, no, it is unquestionably an important growing point, and furthermore, we're here to ask for trouble, so let's dive in. Over the years, there have been many one-gene and two-gene mathematical models for the evolution of various forms of social behavior. And I have to confess that I've always found these models to be to have a distinct air of unreality about them, because in no case did we know that there was a gene governing this or that behavioral difference. We didn't know whether this behavioral difference was governed by one gene or several genes acting as one, let alone had the genes actually been identified. Now that's about to change. The genomes of 8 insect species have been sequenced, including the honeybee. And this was a big undertaking. It took some years and more than 100 researchers. And that's why you see the author is the name of a group. They were not about to put so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. That wouldn't have made any sense. And this will allow us for the first time to identify particular genes with particular behaviors. Furthermore, when the genomes of other social insect species are mapped, as will happen in the near future, it will be possible to know whether some of the parallel developments, some of the parallel resemblances that we see, for instance, between ants and termites, which have been genealogically separated for well over 100 million years, whether some of these are due to the independent evolution of the same genes. Well, now that's fairly exciting. So last week, I sent an email to the leader of the honeybee sequencing group. And I said, you know, we really shouldn't just leave it up to the vagaries of individual research groups to decide which species come to the head of the line. We need to have a collective decision about this so we can prioritize. And he wrote right back to me and he said, gee, Chris, that is a really smart idea. It's so smart that we're already doing it. So, you know, it's nice to be right every now and then, even if somebody else was right way ahead of you. I will submit the written version of this lecture for publication before the end of this semester. And if you wish, you can find it on my website, or you can directly ask me for a copy if you wish to see that. This lecture has been in the spirit of a wonderful book, the Encyclopedia of Ignorance. 51 entries about things that we don't know. Now, this book was published a generation ago, and yet it continues to be quite valuable today. Now, I have some extra copies. So if you are a secondary school teacher or a parent of secondary school students, and you think that a copy of this belongs in your school library, come and see me.
Congratulations again.
Thank you very much.
Well done, Christopher Starr. So we know about now what are social insects now. So we try to grow some ants there in the yard. You said that has some beneficial effects too. Bachak, as you said, bachaks.
Let me speak to that, Shivananda. Sometimes people say, I've got ants in my kitchen. What should I do about them? Well, let me give you an answer to that. They like a little bit of sugar. And so, just put a little, bit of wet sugar out for them, and they'll be there for you to admire your own personal ants right in your own personal kitchen. I mean, who could resist?
So what do you suggest about bachaks then?
If part of your livelihood depends on protecting your crops against bachaks, you're forgiven.
Anyhow, I don't take a chance anyhow in the kitchen and all, okay? Anyhow, now it's open for discussion now. If you have any questions, you can ask Professor Christopher Starr now. He will be able to answer your questions, and you have 10 to 15 minutes for open discussion.
Your brains are full, huh?
Good afternoon. Thanks for a very interesting, stimulating lecture. In terms of the growing point, where it says the ecological impact, what are your thoughts in terms of how this ecological impact could have an economical impact in terms of research and, money making the world go round and stuff?
Well, one key emerging area of environmental studies has to do with ecosystem services. We rely upon ecosystem services to survive. The very survival of the world, not just us, but the survival of the world, depends on these ecosystem services. And so the real question then I think you're asking is, what do social insects have to do with ecosystem services? Do they have a key role? And in some cases, the answer is certainly yes, and I've given you some examples there. Lena Dempewolf in her research is now trying to actually measure how valuable bees are to the farmers in Nariva. The wild bees. They're not kept bees. They're not apiary bees. But how valuable those are. That is something that can be quantified. And as this general area of research expands, I think we will certainly find that ecosystem services are critical. Well, we know that, but we'll be able to prove it to anybody who doubts it. And I think probably it will be demonstrated that social insects very often provide critical ecosystem services. And then the question from my point of view will be, well, why, what helps them to do that? And some will say, well, it's their sociality that's the key thing. That remains to be seen. Another question over here. Yes, Ed.
Здравствуйте, Chris. Спасибо большое. I'm Russian. The man speaks Russian. I'm fascinated by the comparisons between insects and humans. In humans at the moment, we're seeing the development of what are being called resource wars. As a resource becomes scarce, then groups of humans are competing with each other. What happens with your communities, your colonies, both within the colony and between the colony, in the presence of diminishing resources?
Well, that's a good question. I can't think of any any situation, I haven't observed any situation in which colonies go to war against each other over resources. They will sometimes go to war. There are sometimes raiding parties. I mean, army ants, for instance, raid to get larvae and pupae to eat. And I have occasionally seen at water pools in the dry season in a very arid environment, I have occasionally seen social insects competing for access to the water. But nothing, as far as I'm aware, that resembles the colony as a whole going out to war over a resource. It's an interesting question, though. I must admit I'd never thought of it before. You're practically a student, Brent, in the way you make me think of things that hadn't occurred to me before. So I'll answer that question with a great big question mark. Yes, Sally. No weevils are social, and there's the reason for that is probably not complicated. They do not nest, and so a weevil, like most solitary insects, will lay its egg in the plant, and then will just go away because it has done all the providing it can do. But I mean, I have studied weevils. I was once given the opportunity to study one of two species of sweet potato weevils, and one of them was small, and it was smaller than the other, and it was much more colorful. The other one was bigger, easier to see, but kind of drab. So, believe it or not, I chose the lesser of two weevils. I move that be stricken from the record, Your Honor. Last chance.
Very good afternoon, everybody. It was an excellent,
Oh, I'm
lecture.
sorry, Ashok, I didn't see you up there.
very interesting, and your statement that the social insects are better than the other ones was well supported by a part of what you have written in the summary of the summary. The great success of social insects is seen in their numbers and biomass, statistically significant. Now, of course, you have said that how they contribute to ecological success is a bit open to research. My point as a layperson will be particularly observing and noting that you are so successful and attained researcher, that which social insect you found most interesting or exciting or whatever. Thank you.
Okay, well, there are two ways of approaching that question, Ashok. One is, which is most likely to serve to give particular penetrating research results, which serves to answer hypotheses best. But there's another way of looking at it. In my business, let's be frank, we like some kinds of animals or bugs more than others. And there are some that I just really like. They're just a lot of fun to be around. There's a genus, a widespread pan-tropical genus of ants, very common in the country from which you come, Ashok, India, that make their nests with silk. And there are many different species, and the kinds of nests they make are extremely variable. And physically, they're extremely variable. So I have never gotten tired of looking at these ants. In this part of the world, every now and then, maybe a couple of times a year, there will be army ants raiding across my patio. And I'm standing out there on my patio, and especially if it's in the morning, the orange-winged parrots are coming over. I've got bees nesting in the house. I've got 3 species of wasps nesting under my eaves. The yellowtails may be swinging their axe in the palm right outside my bedroom window. There's a babbling brook, or what Trinidadians with a straight face call a river, just across the way. And army ants in huge numbers are going across my patio, and I look and I say, this must be the place. So I have eaten the cascadoo, I moved 23 times as an adult, and if I have my choice, I won't do it again.
Just one more. Chris? Just one more question.
Mike Rutherford has a question.
You spent your life studying social insects, organisms that have learned how to evolve to cooperate and get along. Do you feel this has contributed to your own ability to wonderfully get along with all those around you?
Oh, I think we better sharpen our claws. What Mike means is, if I study social insects, the very picture of harmony, why am I so difficult to get along with, and why have all my ex-wives quit on me? I don't think that deserves an answer. Okay, I think we're at a good point, Shivananda.
Thank you, Professor Chris. You know, organizing this professorial inaugural lecture, there are many pillars and many people behind this to make it success. So I will request Dr. Sharon Hutchinson from, I think, Agriculture and Economics to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Shivananda Nayak, Acting Chair, Open Lectures Committee. Professor Inda Ramnarayan, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology. Professor Christopher Starr, Professor of Entomology and featured speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Well, I must admit that we've had a very exciting lecture here today. It makes it easier when we have such a distinguished speaker who can also give us the lighter side of this discipline and the lighter side of life to bring it all together for us. Before I get into the thank yous, I just want to do a quick overview because he's come to us really to say what are the key areas that need research in this discipline at this point, which is something that he admitted at the beginning people don't like to do. And so we must commend the effort to be bold and to put the questions out there. The first question was, how does sociality evolve? And he was suggesting that it actually evolves very quickly over time. It doesn't really take a long time to evolve. But it seems to evolve because being social conveys an advantage over a solitary lifestyle. And over time, people have looked around to see whether or not there were solitary insects such as the ants, termites, bees, and wasps. They couldn't find any, even in the most extreme biological habitats that might have encouraged that kind of development. The second key question was, how are within colony conflicts resolved? So we were looking at the issues of whether the queen wins, the workers win, or whether the colony wins. And from his own work, it seems to be that natural selection at the level of the colony is at work to determine the outcomes of these conflicts. We can see some of these things, of course, in our own lives and in other areas, but looking at it from the role of social insects is particularly interesting to note that. The third main going point that Professor Starr brought out today was the question of what shapes the colony cycle. And at this point, researchers are using the theory of the life cycle as a mirror of looking at the development of the colony. And while people feel that there are quite close similarities, he believes that there's still a lot more work in order to demonstrate the similarities that we think exist. The fourth main growing point was, what does sociality have to do with ecological impact? And this is one of the questions that came out here this afternoon. And before we could even begin to answer that question, he'd indicated that we have to get a better sense of what percentage of the biomass the social insects in particular represent before we could begin to understand the ecological impacts and quantify in monetary terms some of the economic effects that, again, someone had a good question on. So this becomes really important. We know, of course, things like bees are already very important as pollinators, etc. But many times you have to come to value these impacts from a biological perspective as well as an economic perspective. And then the final main question was, what is the relationship between the genome and sociality? Of course, everybody wants to know which gene contributes to which kind of behavior. We know from our human world that is a big question. It also answers questions about disease. Professor Starr didn't mention that specifically. But of course, in terms of overcoming diseases in insects and understanding their behavior towards us and other flora and fauna, we need to get a better understanding of the genome sequence. And so that work has already begun. So he has brought us these 5 main questions that he feels researchers around the world need to focus on at this point. So it gives me great pleasure to bring this evening's proceedings to a close with a few thank yous. First of all, I would like to thank the staff of the Office of the Campus Principal for hosting this event. I would also like to thank the staff of Marketing and Communications for all the advertising, and I see we have a very good turnout here tonight. Thank you. We also like to thank the members of the Open Lectures Committee for their hard work in planning these lectures, and we expect many more this semester, and as the campus principal indicated throughout the year. We also like to thank the Faculty of Engineering for the use of these facilities, and also we thank the Division of Facilities Management for their overall support in giving us plans and other support for this occasion. I particularly would like to thank Mrs. Patricia Sampson for coordinating quite a few of the efforts behind the scenes. And I want to thank you, the audience, for being here, giving up such a big, important time of your Thursday afternoon to come here and really reflect and listen on what Professor Starr had to say. And finally, let us all give Professor Starr a round of applause for such a great lecture. Thank you, Professor Starr. Thank you very much. We have refreshments outside. Some people have gotten chits, even so. You can help yourself to refreshments. Thank you again for coming.